Imagine traveling back millions of years. No cities, no houses, no hospitals, no books, no phones, no internet, not even language as we know it today. You look across an ancient landscape and see a group of early human ancestors moving through the environment. And then a strange question suddenly comes to your mind. Who was the first human to ever have sex? Was there a specific man? A specific woman? A specific moment when something happened for the very first time? And could we ever discover who they were? The answer is one of the strangest mysteries in human evolution. Because the truth is, there probably was no single first human who suddenly invented sex. Sexual reproduction is far, far older than humanity. Long before Homo sapiens existed, countless organisms were already reproducing sexually. And our own evolutionary story goes back millions of years. Scientists estimate that the human lineage has been evolving for roughly 6 million years or more, while modern Homo sapiens appeared much later, around 300,000 years ago. So when we ask, when did the first human have sex? We are actually asking a much bigger question. When did our ancestors begin behaving in ways that eventually became part of human sexual behavior? And this is where the mystery begins. Because unlike stone tools, bones, or footprints, sexual behavior usually doesn't leave behind an obvious fossil. Imagine an ancient human leaving a stone tool behind. Thousands or even millions of years later, an archaeologist can discover that tool. They can examine it. They can estimate its age. They can compare it with other discoveries. But imagine an ancient pair simply living their lives. There is no stone object that says, these two humans reproduced here 500,000 years ago. There is no fossil with a label saying, first human couple. There is no ancient diary describing what happened. So scientists have to reconstruct the story indirectly. They look at bones. They study anatomy. They compare humans with other primates. They study genetics. They examine evidence of social behavior. And they try to understand how different traits evolved over enormous periods of time. The Smithsonian's Human Origins program notes that evidence for human evolution comes from fossils, genetics, and traces of behavior, while the exact relationships and behaviors of ancient human species can remain difficult to reconstruct. And this is important, because when we imagine ancient humans, we often picture them as primitive versions of modern people. But evolution didn't work like that. There wasn't one day when an animal went to sleep and woke up as a human. Human evolution happened gradually, generation after generation, population after population, millions of years of small changes. Our ancestors were changing physically. Their brains were changing. Their bodies were changing. Their social lives were changing. And their reproductive strategies were changing too. So the idea of a first sex is probably misleading. There were almost certainly countless generations of ancestors reproducing long before modern humans appeared. In fact, sexual reproduction existed in the animal world long before the human lineage. Our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, also have complex social and sexual behaviors. Humans did not invent sex. We inherited the biological machinery for reproduction from an ancient evolutionary past. But something much more interesting happened later. Human sexual behavior became connected to an enormous number of other things: social relationships, pair bonding, jealousy, family, childcare, cooperation, competition, and eventually culture. But when did those connections begin? That's much harder to answer. Imagine an early human group living thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago. Survival would have been difficult. Food had to be found. Predators had to be avoided. Children had to be protected. Shelter had to be found. And humans had to cooperate. A newborn human is extremely dependent compared with many other mammals. A baby cannot simply walk away after birth. It needs protection. It needs food. It needs years of care. That means reproduction wasn't simply about producing a baby. The survival of that baby also mattered. And this may help explain why human social relationships became so complex. But here's where we need to be careful. Scientists cannot simply look at modern human relationships and assume ancient humans behaved exactly the same way. Different early human species lived in different environments. There were also multiple human species living at different times. The human evolutionary family tree was much more complicated than the simple image of one species replacing another. Some early human species disappeared, others left descendants, and some interacted with each other. For example, modern humans and Neanderthals were closely related, and genetic evidence shows that the histories of these populations were connected. So even the story of reproduction between ancient human populations is more complicated than we once imagined. But let's return to our original question. Who was first? The uncomfortable answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. There is simply no scientific evidence that can identify the very first sexual encounter in the human lineage. But that doesn't mean the question is useless. Actually, it opens a much bigger mystery, because perhaps the more interesting question isn't who had sex first. Perhaps it is, how did human sexual behavior evolve into what it is today? Think about it. At some point in our distant past, our ancestors were not just reproducing. They were forming social relationships. They were raising children. They were competing for partners. They were protecting offspring. They were communicating. And eventually they developed increasingly complex emotional and cultural lives. But when did emotions like attraction, jealousy, or romantic attachment become important? That's difficult to pinpoint. There is no fossil of the first crush. No skeleton can tell us this person was in love. No archaeological site can definitively identify the first romantic relationship. These are behaviors that don't preserve easily, yet clues exist. Human anatomy contains evidence about our evolutionary history. Our genes contain evidence. The differences between males and females in ancient populations can provide clues about mating systems. Even the physical structure of early human species can sometimes help researchers think about their social behavior. For example, scientists examine sexual dimorphism, the physical differences between males and females, to investigate possible aspects of ancient social and mating systems. But these clues are not perfect. They don't give us a complete movie of ancient life. They're more like pieces of a gigantic puzzle, and we are trying to reconstruct a story that happened millions of years ago. Now imagine something even stranger. What if the first Homo sapiens sexual encounter happened around 300,000 years ago? Would those two people have understood what they were doing in the same way we do? Probably not in every sense. They would have lived in a completely different world. They wouldn't have modern concepts of dating. They wouldn't have wedding ceremonies like many societies have today. They wouldn't have social media. They wouldn't have romantic movies. They wouldn't have modern ideas about relationships. But biologically, they were still part of the same species that eventually became us. And their descendants carried their genes forward, generation after generation. Eventually, those descendants spread across Africa. Later, groups of Homo sapiens migrated into other parts of the world. They encountered new environments. They developed different cultures. They created tools. They made art. They developed increasingly complex symbolic worlds. And eventually, humans created something that could preserve memories. Writing. That changed everything, because now humans could finally record things. But even written history begins incredibly late compared with human evolution. For hundreds of thousands of years before writing, humans lived without leaving detailed written explanations of their personal lives. So when you ask, who was the first human to have sex? You're asking about a moment that happened long before recorded history, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before writing, maybe millions of years before modern humans. And perhaps the most surprising possibility is that there wasn't one first moment at all. There was a gradual transition. Our ancestors inherited reproductive behavior from earlier animals. Their descendants inherited it from them. Over millions of years, bodies changed, brains changed, social structures changed, and human behavior became increasingly complex. So instead of one ancient couple standing at the beginning of the story, imagine an enormous chain, millions of generations, countless births, countless relationships, countless unknown individuals whose names we will never know. Every one of us is connected to that chain. And that's what makes the question so fascinating. Somewhere deep in the past, an ancient ancestor of yours was alive. They had parents. Those parents had parents, and those parents had parents. The chain stretches backward through thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions of years. And every link had to survive long enough for the next generation to exist. If just one link in that chain had disappeared, you wouldn't be here. So maybe the real mystery isn't discovering the identity of the first human who had sex. Maybe the real mystery is understanding how an ancient biological behavior eventually became part of the complicated human world we know today. Love, families, jealousy, marriage, attraction, parenthood, and human connection. All of these things have histories, but those histories don't begin with one single person. They emerge from millions of years of evolution. And somewhere inside that enormous history, there were humans who lived, loved, reproduced, raised children, survived disasters, and disappeared without leaving their names behind. We will probably never know who the first one was, but we do know something incredible. Their story didn't end with them. It continued through generation after generation, until eventually, one of those generations became us. And that's the strangest part of human evolution. We are not just looking back at ancient humans. In a biological sense, we are their continuation.